Hello, everyone, and welcome to our program, and welcome to our program, Understanding and Mitigating Hate, from the UCLA Initiative to Study Hate. We have a group of very knowledgeable faculty from a variety of different departments on campus with us today to present what we hope will be an interesting and informative program. I am Judith Angel, President of Women in Philanthropy. For those of you who don't know, Women in Philanthropy celebrates and inspires women's giving across the UCLA campus. We have been in existence for over 30 years and boast over 3,100 members. Our members contribute their time, their talent, and their resources to every corner of this university. We also foster women's leadership at UCLA. Our members serve on boards and committees across campus, as well as holding positions within the UCLA Foundation. Through large-scale events like this, we are able to showcase different areas of campus, giving members of Women in Philanthropy from across the country special access to programs and subjects they wouldn't normally have. On to the program. The Institute to Study Hate was created to understand and tackle this vexing and pervasive phenomenon. Housed in the Bhandari Kindness Institute in the Division of Social Sciences, it is a 3-year pilot program of research and teaching to understand and, most importantly, to mitigate hate. I'm sure everyone has felt the rising political and economic tensions of late that have resurfaced old hatreds and have led to the expression of new ones. As a public university, the task at UCLA is to study these new and old forms of hate and propose novel ways of addressing them. The initiative is a collaborative effort bringing together researchers, our faculty and students, nonprofits, government officials, and members of the private sector who share a common desire to understand and combat hate. We are lucky today to have Dr. Amalia Mora as our moderator. Amalia is an ethnomusicologist who studies the relationship between gender-based hate and the performing arts. She is a lecturer in the online Human Rights Practice Program and an affiliated faculty member for the Applied Intercultural Arts Research Program at the University of Arizona. This makes her the perfect person to facilitate today's program. Dr. Mora will introduce our presenters, who will begin by sharing a bit of information about their research and experiences. Then the presenters will answer questions posed by Dr. Mora. There will be time after the conversation for the panelists to answer questions, so please submit them through the question and answer function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Your questions will be compiled by staff so Amalia can present them to our panelists. We may not be able to get to all of them, so please forgive us if we don't get to yours. And with that, I turn the program over to Dr. Amalia Mora.
Thank you so much, Judith, for that fabulous introduction. So like Judith said, my name is Amalia Mora, and in addition to my teaching, I'm also the research manager for the Initiative to Study Hate. And, given my commitment to fighting for gender equity and building a world in which women are not only safe, but thrive, I'm so excited to be here this evening and to welcome this discussion with three scholars from the UCLA Initiative to Study Hate, who will engage in conversation about their work and more specifically their research on hate with the initiative. And they're also going to be sharing suggestions about how we all as individuals and a community can help to mitigate the hate in our lives. These scholars are just an example of the amazing research that's been being done at the initiative, which has over the past year 73 research projects and created a community of over 115 multidisciplinary researchers from across campus, hailing from disciplines from anthropology to neuroscience to computer science. And part of what makes this synergy so strong is the community is made up of not only faculty, but also postdoctoral fellows, research staff, graduate students, even undergraduate students. And many of our researchers' projects, including some of the ones that you're going to hear about today, involve partnerships with communities and nonprofits, as Judith alluded to. And we ourselves at the initiative have also formed collaborations with outside extramural partners, including the California Civil Rights Department and LA County, to ensure that the incredible research that is being generated by the initiative has impact beyond academia. So the three panelists that you'll hear from have made substantial contributions to our understanding of hate and its impact on individuals and society, with the goal of ultimately using their findings to build a less hateful and a more compassionate world, which we all know is very needed right now. So with no further ado, I'm going to just introduce you to our panelists. I'll tell you their names and their titles, and then I will pass the mic on to each panelist who will tell you a little bit about their research and then tell you about their research with the Initiative to Study Hate. So I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Bethan Johnson. Dr. Johnson is a postdoctoral fellow for the UCLA Initiative to Study Hate. We also have Dr. Sadia Gabriel, an assistant professor of computer science here at UCLA. And last but not least, we also have Dr. Christine Ong, senior researcher at the National Center for Research on Evaluation, Standards, and Student Testing, otherwise known as CREST, at UCLA. With that said, Bethan, I will pass the mic on to you.
You so much, Maya, for the introduction and obviously for all of the organizers who've been doing all this amazing work, putting this together, and for putting a spotlight on all of the research that we at ISH have been doing over these past 3 years in a pilot program. So as Amalia said, my name is Dr. Bethan Johnson. I am finishing my postdoctoral fellowship with UCLA's Initiative to Study Hate. And my focus and concentration both before and as I have been with ISH has been off at the Anglophone world, so Australia, South Africa, Europe, and North America. Working at whilst at working with Dr. Myers on a piece of research regarding the historical definitions of hate, the evolution therein, and the manifestations across different time periods and geographies. Both are trained historians. That's how I started. I feel a bit like an interloper in some ways studying the various iterations of hate that I look at now, which are far more contemporary, but traditionally speaking, I am a trained historian. And so one of the great parts of the research that I've done with Ish and Dr. Myers has been looking at this evolution of hate all the way back from Aristotelian times all through to today to see the hate is kind of ever changing and yet ever the same. And it's been a really expanding intellectual experience and exercise. Also has certainly deepened my research when it comes to other white papers that I produce or critical thinking when I speak to journalists or things that are affected by hate. It's been a really lovely experience there. And I guess I'll pass on to Sadia now.
Hi, I'm Sadia. I'm assistant professor in computer science, where I'm running the Misinformation, AI, and Responsible Society lab, and I'm also affiliated with the Bunch Center for African American Studies. So my particular area of computer science is focused on natural language processing. So trying to use computational methods to process human language and understand the ways in which that manifests and nuances of language And a lot of the prior work I'd done was looking into developing evaluations of AI tools for mitigating the rapid spread of hate speech that we've been witnessing across social media, as well as trying to come up with interventions that deal with some of the shortcomings we've observed in these AI tools. The current work that I'm collaborating on with Ish is looking into how do we actually bring more community perspectives from people who are targeted by toxic language or hate speech into the development process of these AI tools, and how do we get these tools to better adhere to the norms of the platforms or online communities in which they're deployed. So one major finding from the prior work that I conducted during my graduate research in computer science was actually that existing state-of-the-art moderation tools were very brittle to surface level patterns, and that they were exploiting to identify hate speech. So meaning that if there were obviously bad words or even mentions of demographic groups like Jewish or Muslim or Black, without there actually being some malintent or malicious content, the system would falsely flag that as being hate speech. And of course, this is going to be deeply problematic because a lot of benign examples are then going to be incorrectly flagged. It could also lead to more implicit sort of examples that are not using these words being missed. So those harmful examples are allowed to actually propagate on social media. And we got some media, quite a bit of media attention back in 2019 for this work from Forbes and others, where we were showing that a lot of these popular systems like Google Perspective API could actually discriminate against communities because they were learning this incorrect behavior and how to identify hate speech. So they were actually identifying keywords that were associated with hate speech without taking into account the context in which those words were appearing. And the specific keywords were leading to them discriminating against minority communities like African American, English speakers, and then actually creating this ironic situation where those speakers who are most vulnerable to hate speech are being discriminated against by the tools that are being deployed to combat hate speech. So after that, I also did some collaboration with industry researchers. I worked with a team at Microsoft Research to develop a now patented data generation framework that could try to repair these existing content moderation systems and make them more sensitive to implicit toxic language and less likely to discriminate against minority speakers. And I'm very much driven these days in my research group of trying to close this gap in the current development of these content moderation tools, where users who are actually being affected by the tools are often excluded from the development process. So I want to come up with better development pipelines and a framework for the data annotation for the training data and pipeline for model development that actually incorporates voices from these affected communities into the development process and make sure that these people who are affected by the online safety policies being developed have some say in how their language is treated and what is defined as being hate or toxic language.
And I'll quickly introduce myself. My name is Christine Ong. I'm a senior researcher at CREST, which is part of the School of Education and Information Studies. In terms of my background, I feel very fortunate as a CREST researcher. My expertise or area of focus has generally been in program evaluation. So I've been able to work with lots of folks, both on campus and in the community, in evaluating curricula, in developing data systems to look at teacher preparation, retention, placement. I was very fortunate to start out as a graduate student here working at the lab school with a curriculum called Safe School Cool Tools. Some of you might know it. And now working on a study called Social Media and the Spread of Hate, which is generously sponsored by ISH. And we work with our partners, Organization for Social Media Safety. They're based in Los Angeles, but work across the country, providing programming to schools, middle schools and high schools around being safe on social media. So very excited to be here.
Thanks so much, everyone, for those wonderful introductions. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and begin this panel conversation. And Bethan, I'd like to begin with you. In many countries, the US included, it seems that polarization and hateful rhetoric are unfortunately on the rise. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work as an expert on extremist organizations? And would you say that right-wing extremism is on the rise, both within the US and globally?
Hi, yes. So I think that there's some important context. Perhaps it's because I am a historian. I will say we have to look at these trends and these feelings within at a macro level in order to better understand. So when we talk about things like extremism, that is in fact subjective. Extreme as compared to what? From what lens are we looking? There are, for instance, if you are looking from a US context, certain laws in other countries may be deemed as extreme, which are normative within that society, and vice versa. So I always want to add that caveat in when we're discussing the sort of temperature and climate around what is extremism, both comparatively cross-culturally and transnationally, but also across time. So if we think about cultures and what was considered an extreme, be it left or right, political belief system 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 30 years ago, those are all changing. That said, I think Amalia is correct. The climate that we feel and see on our news screens, it feels much more extreme than it has for quite some time. And that can happen both as it regards to like terror attacks, for instance, that are seemingly more random, that are taking place with arguably at times lower death tolls in a single event, but are happening with a kind of cascading effect wherein one attack, 2019 was a particularly strong year for terror attacks with a kind of cascading effect, especially in the spring onwards. It felt, if you were looking at the news, that one was triggering another and so on and so forth. So we are seeing a lot of evidence that there is that kind of attack. The structures are also changing. So people are going from sort of the traditional image in the United States of going to a Klan meeting if you were anti-Black and racist. In certain parts of the United States, you may have participated in a Klan movement and been part of like an organization where you pay dues, et cetera, and that was an in-person event. Now the transition the last 15 years, thanks in large part to the internet, but also to other changing aspects, has been away from going physically in person and radicalizing through online spaces, and just picking and choosing what content you like from various extremist movements. So we're seeing this interesting amalgamation where you can see an individual who may agree with certain extremist groups on some issues and not on others, or who may in fact be an ethnic or religious minority and yet still subscribe to certain other ideologies that would seem counterintuitive. So neo-fascists who are in theory going to be structuring society in a way that does not help ethnic minorities are still being subscribed to by ethnic minorities. So it's a very complex threat network. I want to always, like I said, put that in the context of the environment is changing, what is considered extreme is changing, but we are seeing those temperatures rise. We're seeing terror attacks on civilian populations at high rates, and the kinds of attacks are changing as well. So it does feel very frightening for many people to live in the world, and that is on purpose by many of these terrorist groups, being they in the right wing or otherwise. The point is to make the world in which we live, liberal democracies, feel untenable. And for a lot of people, that temperature has ratcheted up in the last several years.
Thank you so much. Conversely, I'd love to hear about what your research and others' research shows when it comes to strategies to de-radicalize or to rehabilitate people with extremist or hateful viewpoints.
Yeah, I think there are sort of two spaces that are important to highlight with my research, and I'd be really fascinated by how the other panelists have intersected with this. I often look at the prevention and actual like legal ramifications of people engaging in extremism. So even giving testimony in witness trials and other and I collaborate with individuals who are formers of extremist movements. And so they talk about their rehabilitation processes. And that has changed a lot in recent years because of the number of former members who are setting up organizations, who are speaking at schools and facilitating de-radicalization programs. And that ability to spotlight their experiences and to show people that there is a way out of extremism is very helpful. I think that as significant as counterterrorism legislation and prosecutions are, putting someone in prison is not necessarily going to change their political opinions. So we have to be earnest about the difference between sort of neutralizing a threat in terms of taking them out of society, incarcerating them, and actually effectively de-radicalizing and then reintroducing them into society. So I think that those are all really important. And there still needs to be a lot more research done into that area. But I really hope that it spotlights those who are people who are affected by this or people who are on this radicalization pipeline.
Thanks so much, Bethan. You know, it's becoming more and more clear that young people are being impacted by hate, particularly hate spread through online platforms like the ones that you're discussing, that you mentioned, Bethan, especially social media. Christine, can you elaborate a little bit more on your work with the Initiative to Study Hate and on both the scope of young people's social media use and exposure to hate online? What does that look like?
Sure. So as I'd mentioned, we're partnering with an Organization for Social Media Safety, and they present assemblies throughout the country for students, grades 5 through 12. And these assemblies cover topics such as sexting, depending upon the age, of course, seeing real violence on social media, hate speech, cyberbullying. And so they both provide an opportunity for students and the community, the teachers, the school leaders in the audience to become more aware, but also offer strategies. And so as partners, we're able to analyze data that comes from these assemblies. So while the kids are listening to the presenter, his name is Ed, he's traveling across the country, there are a series of questions that are mixed in about their own experience. And they have handheld clickers where they can anonymously answer things like, have you been cyberbullied? How many hours on average do you think you spend on social media? And so we've been able to analyze these data. They also do things with parents and school leaders, but I'll focus on the school assembly. So here are just some tidbits, some highlights. And this is based on over 29,000 clicker responses since about 2 years of data collection in 10 states. Again, grades 5 through 12, but a portion or the lion's share are coming from middle school students. So slightly more than half 53% report spending 5 or more hours on social media on average a day. Again, these are self-report, but these are perceptions. And actually 19% say that they spend 9 or more hours on social media. So that's something to think about. Roughly 8 in 10 answer that they've encountered hate speech on social media in the last month. And about half, 46% say they've been bullied, cyberbullied. One more thing that I think stands out in my mind, both as a researcher and a parent, is again, throughout the presentation, there are ideas and strategies for how to combat hate and also just keep yourself safe on social media. And one question asked is about their emotional reactions. So last time you saw hate speech, how did you feel? And so students are given a whole list of different feelings to choose from: anger, feeling upset, no emotion, surprise. And unfortunately, we find that about 30% are saying they feel no emotion. Now, it's a very crude measure, and our qualitative work, our discussions with teens, our interviews with undergraduates who can reflect back are already to dig deeper into that response. But I think it does speak to both the amount of hate that students are seeing and also potentially desensitization in seeing those posts.
Thanks, Christine. And I think your research really points to the critical need, right, for interventions to detect hate speech and to intervene, right? So Sadia, that's where your amazing work comes in. And much of your work is seeking to address the fact that even technologies designed to detect online hate can end up perpetuating it, right? Which you spoke to a little bit earlier. Can you tell us, first of all, maybe give us a kind of overview of the landscape of technologies designed to combat online hate, and then how your work is seeking to address some of their shortcomings?
Right, right. So I can get into some of these challenges. I also wanted to say a little bit along the previous point, but I'll start by discussing a bit of an overview of what's been done so far in terms of interventions against hate online. So, of course, pre the AI era, we had human content moderators, but they could only scratch the surface in terms of the rapid spread of information we're seeing and harmful content over social media. So there has been, over the last few years, increasing interest in automated approaches that could actually scale this up with the advantages that an automated algorithm won't need breaks or sleep and isn't going to suffer impacts to mental health because of this constant exposure to toxic content. And so one popular automated method was to think of using block lists. This is a very simplistic approach. It's not an AI-based approach, where you could think of just defining a fixed list of bad words that are filtered out. Of course, a shortcoming of this is that there's a lot of hate and other types of toxic content that don't necessarily contain these words. People with malintent online might specifically try to come up with examples that are more implicit or have misspellings of racially charged language, certain epithets, or curse words, so that it gets around filters. And so we need to have a method that actually takes into account context when determining if it's hate speech or not. Another downside of these block lists is that there's possible words on these lists that could appear in benign cases, like if it's somebody talking about their own experience of being targeted by hate speech, or if they're using reclaimed language, where we have examples of language that were previously deemed offensive, but have been accepted in certain use cases. Like if the speaker identifies as part of a minority group, there's cases of this have been the N-word in the Black community, queer in the LGBTQ community. And so using these block lists could actually end up leading to harms against those users when they're utilizing this language within their communities, but there's no recognition of those boundaries by these interventions. So if you run that over their community, then you would effectively filter their conversations. And so more recently, we've seen efforts to try to apply AI models to this problem and use them to try to take into account some of this context that makes these decisions more complex when we're trying to determine whether or not something is offensive given the community it's appearing in, given the speaker, given the previous interactions. And so we've seen the rise of these powerful computational models of language like ChatGPT that people might be familiar with, that can take text or even multimodal data as input and then transforms those inputs through many layers of operations into this probability distribution where you have some predicted probability of that original input being harmful or being benign. And so in theory, these kind of computational approaches should solve some of the previous problems because they can reason about the whole meaning of the input. Instead of just considering individual words, they can consider the relationship between those words. They consider the context of the language usage. But unfortunately, what we've observed is that they are also limited in terms of their contextual awareness. And then oftentimes they can actually learn shortcuts and that determines their behavior. So even though they're supposed to be taking the context into account, they might still be heavily relying on keywords, and that can lead to some discriminatory decision making, like our finding back in 2019, where we were observing that these AI models were more likely to falsely flag African American English speakers as using toxic language. So a lot of this problem can be traced back to the data. That was the work that I was doing at Microsoft before I came to UCLA, where we found that a lot of this was stemming from this issue where the models were being trained on imbalanced web data that wasn't very representative of all the contexts that we might actually witness when we're deploying these models in the wild. And so because those examples weren't included in the training data, it wasn't learning the right behaviors. And one way to deal with this, to improve the decision making of these models so we don't have this discriminatory behavior, is to try to use AI models to actually generate new data that looks like examples a human might have posted on social media, but we can specifically control to address the gaps that we know are missing. So we can control it. So we have more benign examples that mention groups that are commonly targeted by hate speech. And so then the model's not going to fall back on learning this false association between those keywords and those group mentions and the label. So with the ISH collaboration, we're looking at more types of contexts, trying to learn more about the differences in conversational data and how does offensive language manifest over these long-running conversations, as well as nuances when we're thinking about self-narratives and people relaying their own experiences to try to come up with better AI-based tools that will be able to distinguish between these different online contexts.
Thanks so much, Sadia. And did you say that you wanted to respond to something that
Oh, right. Yeah, so yeah, we've been talking about how do we deal with extremism. And Beth had brought up some wonderful points from her work. I did want to add something onto that. So my work has been mostly centered on reactive interventions, in the sense that we're trying to mitigate the harmful effects of language that's been weaponized or hateful language after it's already happened. But I'm also very much interested in preemptive interventions. So I've worked on this a little bit from the misinformation perspective of thinking about how can we actually use interactions between AI and humans to increase online literacy and critical thinking and empathy. And I had a study last year in collaboration with researchers at MIT where we were creating the simulated social media platform and seeing how different kinds of AI interventions that provide explanations of why content might be unreliable or trying to manipulate users to those users. And we showed that that led to up to a 41% increase in their accuracy at identifying unreliable content. So even though this was focused on misinformation, I think similar kind of approaches could be effective when we're thinking about how do we actually combat hate at scale and decrease the risk of dehumanization, and users mimicking other users and perpetuating acts of hate, maybe because they're not really thinking about it. They're just copying behavior that's become normalized because of the sheer scale of hate speech.
Wow, that's fascinating. Bethan, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I wanted to bring to light also the difficulty in many ways of what we study and knowing exactly the scale of the problem. Vis-a-vis, we have a lot of spotlight and a lot of research and funding regarding, very rightly so, around social media, around media literacy, technology, and the expenses therein. But I think it's also important to highlight the fact that for many individuals, especially younger generations, it could be that they are being radicalized by someone else who was first radicalized online, and we don't take that into account necessarily. So that could be an elder brother, a classmate, a parent, a relative of some other sort, a friend. So that capture doesn't always happen in exactly the direct way that we would like, and certainly has its own problems with regards to like how would you de-radicalize someone who is born to or raised within a family that is itself radical, as opposed to being like someone who has gone online and found these in an isolated incident. So I think we need to spotlight those things as well. And it's one of the great parts of the research that Ish is doing, Christine and others, is like asking people the human side of that experience. But I think it's important to highlight as well the fact that technology contributes to the problem, but I've been studying extremism for years and years. The recruitment of teenage boys, usually around the age of 13 or 14, has been going on. That tends to be, historically speaking, in the US around the age where some lone wolf terrorists, they get into the movement, is at that sort of precipice of teenage years, often through friends or adults whom they trust, or community leaders. So I think it's important to not forget the human element. The technology may exacerbate the metastasis of the problem, but we in the human world are not impervious to that. And so I think that also needs to always be brought into the conversation.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. And on the topic of the limitations of technology, Sadia, what would you say the biggest challenge is in regards to creating like ethical AI, especially AI that tries to mitigate hate? And then not only the limitations of technology, but other factors like big tech. And as a computer scientist, how do you navigate these challenges, especially when it comes to policy and big tech?
Right. Yeah, this is a great question. I think that there's a lot of systemic inequalities that existed far before we had large language models or this AI race in the tech industry, but it can be exacerbated, is what we're seeing now with these technologies. So I'm one of the areas that I'm very much invested in right now is seeing how can we address the fact that the people who are being affected by these content moderation tools that are driven by the tech industry are not actually being involved in the development. And so the evaluations that are being done are not considering aspects of how do people actually communicate with each other on these platforms, and thinking about the differences between different the ways that communities are set up online, and the experiences that the people who these models are processing the language of, um, not understanding the nuances of their cultures and their backgrounds. So I think one thing is that there hasn't been as much incentive from industry to try to correct this. There tends to be a lot of incentive to try to do things quickly, and that doesn't necessarily align with actually having representation. So one of the major challenges that we faced specifically with content moderation is that a lot of data comes from large-scale online crowdsourcing, and the annotators who are most readily available on these types of platforms in the US are not the people who are actually being targeted by toxic language or hate speech historically. They do not identify as minority groups, and so they don't necessarily have the experience to actually identify what is the true label of the training data. And so that can lead to a lot of the errors that we're seeing, like the downstream discriminatory behavior against minority speakers. And so we've done some work trying to see how can we prime people to think beyond their individual experience and consider what the broader impact of these examples might be, instead of thinking, is this deemed offensive or harmful to you? Do you think that this would be offensive or harmful to anyone? But another thing, what we're currently working on with ISH is actually recruiting people from the targeted communities, and having them be involved in this data annotation process and giving their feedback into the development of the training data, and then comparing that against what we would observe from outgroup annotators. And we're noticing it varies a lot depending on the specific targeted groups, but there can be significant differences in terms of how people within those communities label and people outside those communities label. So I think I really want to emphasize this need for better representation, and to make sure that we're involving human perspectives and the people who are targeted at every stage of this development process, both in the actual creation of these tools and then in the evaluation of those tools. And I think that that's something that the industry is slowly recognizing, that there's positive benefits to them from taking that into account as well. But it's a slow process of actually raising awareness of how harmful this can actually be, and that this could have negative impacts on them. Could be legal repercussions, for example.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Nadia. You know, all of this conversation is just making me think of just the changing landscape of hate. And Beth, and you alluded to the radicalization of young boys, and I think that really pivots us nicely to the fact that oftentimes, no matter who the target of a hate group might be, the one linking common factor is misogyny, oftentimes. And you know, research has shown that that sexist and misogynistic language that demeans women is really, really impacting young women and men in different but equally substantial ways. And I was wondering if all of you could speak to how hate and discrimination directed at women, girls, and other gendered minorities has come up in your research, and what does this tell us about how we should perhaps shape our intervention strategies. So I invite any of you to jump in.
I'll jump in first. So I guess there are a few things that I'm thinking about as you're asking that question. From the programming side, that is something that's addressed in some of the work, whether it's asking about different types of hate speech they're seeing, like gender by gender, but also, which by the way, a majority are reporting, yes, they're seeing hate speech that's focused on gender, race, ethnicity, religious beliefs, so unhealthy diet, so to speak. And then on our side, in terms of the research, we know that gender identity is such an important piece of this puzzle, as well as developmental stages and ages. And I think that's one of the challenges right now in the environment is the ability to explore those kinds of questions in a meaningful way that's both sensitive in the way that we ask it, but also understanding the climate that we're in. So we've not been able to, for the secondary students, been able to gather gender data, but for the undergraduate survey we have. And it is interesting, and I think it echoes some of the other research out there, and for example, cyberbullying, that females are reporting in higher numbers, higher rates, and different types of cyberbullying, whether it be spreading rumors, where males are more likely to talk about aggressive behaviors or proposed violence. So there definitely are differences that I think are really important. I mean, of course, there's a range, there's a continuum, but very important when thinking about potential intervention strategies or how to equip folks in engaging.
Thank you, Christine. Beth.
I mean, I have a couple of theories on this issue. I think that part of the reason wherein we see the large amount of misogyny that appears in many iterations of extremism is extremism, in addition to being a kind of ideological element, is also an enterprise. It needs to eat something to sustain itself. And what is a more readily available enemy than approximately half of the population you can vilify or attempt to control, to claim dominance over, etc. So you have a larger audience that will click on your items, that may agree with you, nod their heads along, further your cause, send you money if you engage in hate against a population that people encounter every day for the most part. So I think that there is like a reason, sort of a rationale, not a reason, obviously, a rationale for the vilification of women. And I prefer that term almost to vilification, because there is so much to which it isn't actually about what women do or don't do. It's the perceived nature of women as the enemy. And they are not considered like the hero of any story. They are either like non-issues or they are villains. So I see that often in my research. I was just actually mentioning to Christine, is really interesting. I'm currently in the UK program going on talking about the issues of sort of fragile masculinity in young boys. It's called Adolescence. It's a docu-series, or not a docu-series. It's a fictionalized series, of course, but it is starting a lot of conversations where people are asking these questions around age and yet extreme iterations and manifestations of misogyny, and how much they go hand in hand. And I think part of it is that malleability of the mind as well. You get young people who are trying to figure out who they are, and how they fit in the world and what it means to be from whatever community they might find, be that a gendered community, an ethnic or religious, racial, and they're trying to figure those things out. And they get not used to consuming things, how to feel about themselves and how to understand why they are not, or why things are a struggle. And so the narratives that are being provided by extremists online or even in their personal, it's like someone else is the enemy. often women, often minorities in the cases that I look at. And it provides a much almost like a Disneyfied version where there's like good and evil, and it's super binary in that way. And it appeals to a younger consumer's mind, wherein everything is someone else's fault. And when nobody likes them, it's someone else's fault. If nobody dates them, it's someone else's fault. So we see that a lot. But I do think that the subjugation, villainization of women persists not just in right-wing extremism, but in so many different forms because it's such a target-rich environment for individuals. And a lot of when people do radicalize, at least part of it is based off of they would say, an extremist has said, or extremists do say, partly based off of negative personal experiences. That's not to blame any of the victims of any of those their hate, but just to say that they've identified a hurt that's been done to them, and so they will feel rejection from women, and that will lash out. And so, being 50% of the approximately 50% of the population, there are a number of women who can be that villain in their story, and that sort of spirals off, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I wanted to note that that one of our researchers, not on the call today, is looking at how masculinity messaging and misogynistic messaging is actually used as a recruitment into white supremacy, a recruitment tool, so that this kind of language is espoused online, and it's being used to draw more and more young people into white supremacy. Who may not have otherwise been interested in it at all. And I think that really speaks to, unfortunately, the power of sexist language, misogynistic language. So I'm wondering.
I just wanted to highlight, sorry as well, really, if I could also just say really quickly, there's an important point that women and girls will have to play in a lot of these narratives vis-a-vis like natalism. And we need to talk more about that and about how that intersects with mainstream conversations around sex education, family planning. Because as much as there is a sort of misogynistic anti-female strain, which is really about total incel culture, there's a much larger proportion that do see women, at least for their biopower, to use a Foucault phrase. They need women, they need uteruses, actually. They need uteruses to create the next generation, be that in white supremacy or otherwise. So I think that it's not to say that women are excused from the narrative. They are just essentialized down to some really problematic things. And that feeds into some narratives that mainstream society says about women anyway. Certainly,
and that's a great point, that women sort of can also be impacted and have misogynistic attitudes themselves. And what you're speaking to about natalism, I think we see that in what is known as the trad wife movement, with which maybe we can speak to during the audience Q&A if anyone's interested in that. I think that, so we know that there are very kind of extreme and explicit forms of hate that's being spread. But when we get into the conversation about more benign messaging, like even women posting these tradwise videos, that's not explicitly hateful, but nonetheless, it contributes to this larger climate of misogynistic culture.
And self-hate potentially as well, which I think is really concerning.
Self-hate, great, yes, excellent.
Yeah,
Sadia?
I think that, oh, I was going to say that I think that in terms of interventions, that's something that we do really need to consider, is not just looking at the more explicit examples or the overt hate speech, but also the subtler ways in which misogyny and can manifest, or we end up creating through our language environments that are conducive to more overt types of violence against women and hate. So in some of our prior work and work from others, I'm thinking particularly of a study from Yulia Svetskov's group. She's now at the University of Washington, that was considering microaggressions and the ways in which there's these subtle kind of behaviors that might actually set certain norms about how women should be treated or what are women's position in society. It doesn't even necessarily have to be behaviors that would be identified by the majority as being negative behaviors. A lot of positive behaviors can actually ultimately be harmful, and that's something that we've been looking into is positive stereotyping, or cases where you might have maybe there's a more focus on women's appearance over intellectual contributions. So I think that it's can be hard to quantify these types of ways in which these behaviors are demonstrated, but this is part of why it's even more important to have uh, representation of people who are involved, who are being targeted by this kind of language in the development process, because that's something where maybe to a lot of male annotators, they wouldn't notice these more seemingly positive examples as actually being harmful, or maybe they're not going to pick up on the microaggressions. But that's something that people who've actually gone through that and lived through that would pick up on them immediately. It's going to be an immediate flag to them. And so I do think that we need to take that into account when we're thinking about interventions.
Excellent point, and that segues us beautifully into the audience Q&A portion of the conversation. And Sadia, there's a question for you, very much related to what you were just talking about. So someone says, decisions about AI and social media are being made by a small group of mostly white men. How do we persuade big tech to include women and people of color in every step of the process?
Yeah, so that's that's a good question. That's a challenging question. I think part of it is pointing out how does this affect their bottom line? So ultimately, they have their own agenda uh, to their shareholders and their objectives of their these corporations to fulfill. And so if we can point out, I think being able to point out the errors that are taking place in existing systems and where tracing back where that's coming from, tracing back, who's actually being involved in data annotation and showing this is actually leading to these misbehaviors, and then these misbehaviors are leading to these broader impacts when the systems are deployed, and that could lead to bad publicity and to perhaps legal challenges. Um, that's one way of making the case, and I suspect that that's led to some of a shift in terms of there being a little bit more focus on AI safety. I feel like some of it's been pulled back, unfortunately, over the last year or so, last few months. But there has been a little bit more of a focus on that in recent times. So that's one way. There's been some work showing that having more diversity and having more representation is financially beneficial. So I think that kind of publicity also helps in making them aware. Um, so that's really what I've been focused on. So I've had a few collaborations with industry, including the Microsoft work, and during that we had a lot of conversations about why do we want to use certain types of interventions? Why can't we just use block lists? And so it really was about showing them these kind of error examples, showing them where things are going wrong, really emphasizing how bad this can get and why it's important for them to pour their funding and their time into actually trying to take this into account. And I think that that's had some effect, but we need lots of voices involved in this, and we need to try to amplify that as much as possible.
Thank you so much. We have another question from the audience, which is directed to all three of you, which is, what do you measure to determine if your research or work is making a difference?
I'll start off. I think there are two things that I'm considering. So first off is just that within our project, we're generating a lot of information at the community level, kind of a snapshot of a school. So one area to understand is making a difference is simply how are schools using these data? Are they looking back at these reports and reflecting on it? Is it sparking conversation? Because that's really the hope, is that this sparks conversation. What's happening? How can we better help our students? We've actually been able, again, our partners, OFSMS, have actually been able to raise some of the results from our research in recent testimony with Congress. So there's the impact there of just sharing the message, sharing what we're learning to engage in further conversation. The dream is, and OFSMS is now able to go to some schools more than once. The dream is to begin to look over time at those snapshots. So are we seeing changes? Right now, we have data from these assemblies. It's fairly short, but if we could begin to survey students regularly over time, so we begin to gather a longitudinal snapshot of change in both behaviors as well as hopefully reflection. So I think one thing that we've talked about here and is a real push for the future is developing more critical thinking skills and awareness. So it's not just the content itself or stopping the content and moderating it, but also how do we approach it? How are we thinking critically? And data showing that over time will be really essential.
I really as a person who for many years and there's no anyone who has sat in an ivory tower and contemplated things of the past. I really wanted to make sure that I could trace some discernible ways in what I was doing was more than just an intellectual exercise to keep me busy over time. And so I look at the impact question in a few different ways. I think first, when you are talking to many people, part of our work is also how we teach and what we teach in which we teach. And that's kind of an intangible way that we are students out into the world and the projects that they put forward, we have a small part of us in that level. But that said, I've really challenged myself, and Ish has been really supportive in that, in allowing me to do real world grounded intervention-esque work. So currently, hate and yeah.
Bethan, you're cutting out a little bit.
Yeah.
So could you potentially type what you were saying? Because it's so fascinating. Could you just type it into the chat?
Okay. Yeah. So I'll type it out.
Thank you so
it
much.
just happens when you
Right. I know. Well, we'll all be on the edge of our seats waiting for the info to come into the chat.
And Amalia, while Bethan is typing, one thing I realized I should have said is that also the data generated through the OFSMS partnership, as well as our piloting of an undergraduate survey, are really feeding back into the programming. So it's been helpful for our educators who are developing programs to really figure out kind of where do they go next? What are the trends telling them? So anyway, another area where we're hoping to show impact and how the research is being used.
Great. Yeah. And I think that leads me to, the conversation on, moving forward, looking forward, having things to be hopeful about. I was just wondering how you, or what advice the three of you would give to the audience, maybe regarding how they, as individuals, and a community, can work to mitigate hate and also protect themselves and those who are most vulnerable to it.
Okay, I'll jump to it, please. Sadia, join in. So I guess there are a few things. First, I think we all need to think perhaps more critically about our own behaviors, our own media diets, especially for thinking about how we model, whether we are explicit or not. Our kids are the ones that we love are watching us and what we do. So I think that's important to think critically about, what are we doing? Are we giving ourselves time to pause from when we see something to what we post or respond that may or may not be kind? The kids are taught a step process, which I think adults can really think about too, that we're stopping, we're thinking, is what we're going to say true, helpful? Oh my goodness, the eyes for inspirational, necessary, kind, and then also empathy. I think empathy is a really important part, and I've forgotten who gave that which one of us talked about it, but that idea of perspectives and storytelling, giving space and time for that is really important. Active listening for one another. Those are a few things that I'm thinking of. And again, it's building our own toolbox. In terms of just thinking about, so I often hear stories. I'm able to go to these presentations. So one story I heard recently is that a fifth grader raised their hand and said, "Okay, if I'm not supposed to be on social media so much, what do I do?" So I think we all need to remind ourselves, what else can we do? What do we enjoy? Because unfortunately, I think sometimes our constant companion is with us. And if you are just looking at a restaurant, it's so easy to go back. And anyway, those are some thoughts just about general well-being and health, which I think goes along with mitigating hate and hateful messages.
Yeah, just to add on to that, then I want to say I don't know if everybody in the audience here is a frequent user of social media, but even if you know other people, like maybe your friends or your children, grandchildren, um, spreading the word about what you've heard here and about how they can themselves be more critical, and trying to perhaps yourself learn more about the background of why do these behaviors manifest in the first place, and trying to then instill those values and teaching others, how do they prevent themselves from repeating these behaviors that have become ingrained in our society, and are fortunately perpetuated and amplified by social media. And I don't want to encourage anyone to necessarily directly engage with the kind of people who perpetuate hate online, but a lot of these platforms like X, and Facebook have moved to user-driven approaches to content moderation and regulation of information, where it's very much reliant on users being proactive about commenting or flagging when they see harmful content. So I think one thing is encouraging people and also engaging this in yourself if you are a social media user, trying to, if you see harmful content, of not just passing it by, but actually trying to bring attention to that so that it can be mitigated. And I think I think the last thing I'll add on to all of this is, um, this is a little bit more engagement, but advocating with local governments and advocating potentially directly with platforms to take action about harmful content that's being spread.
And there are definitely examples I know of bills that have been passed both through the state and well, working towards federal legislation that really have started with as grassroots movements with parents, with communities that have felt strongly.
Thank you. Thank you both for
And
that.
I would say, let's see if maybe this works or just an odd will work. Um, but I would also um, feel able to engage directly, perhaps of their own, your own, um, or
Oh, Bethan, you're cutting out again. I'm so sorry.
I'll send it in the chat.
Thank you. Yeah, and I on that note, I've been thinking a lot about even how the Surgeon General came out warning about social media use for kids under, I think Christine, is it under 15 or 13? I can't remember, but and I think that with that recognition, I think is a step in the right direction. And just thinking about how isolating the use of social media is, you mentioned thinking about other things that kids and young people or people in general can do. And one related epidemic that we are having in this country and perhaps internationally is loneliness and isolation. And loneliness that is driving a lot of people to um, more radical, hateful spaces online. A lot of them are seeking community. It's a bad, horrible community, but nonetheless, part of what is driving that is loneliness. And so I think we also, collectively, as a society, have to address the loneliness epidemic. Um, and so I was wondering, um, for everyone, are there any aspects of hate that have surprised you in both good and bad ways?
I'll jump in. I have a teenage daughter, so I think there's so much more I have to learn, but being able to learn a little bit more about the culture, the ecosystem of some of these apps, in particular, some of the ways, whether it's dark humor or dissonance of say, images and comments mixed together, ways that people can spread hate or meanness in ways that other people might not recognize it, but it can be incredibly harmful. And then I guess just connected to that, something that stuck with me is Walther's talking about hate speech is oftentimes collateral damage. So it might not even be, the intent might not even be really focused on hurting that other person or group, as much as I think, Bethan, you know a lot about this, bringing yourself or connecting yourself to others or community or raising your own, sense of authority. And it's something that I hadn't really thought about much before this work.
Thank you. And I guess on a related note, Sadia, I'll start with you, and I'd like all the panelists to answer this. What keeps you up at night, and what gives you hope?
Yeah, so this might be a little bit of an answer to the previous one as well as what keeps me up at night, I think, is how intrinsic uh hate can become in our society and how as an AI researcher, I see that shaping the technologies that we have. So when we had the project, when we were working on this automated data generation from these AI models, these large language models, that involved also generating examples of harmful content to train on. And it was really alarming to actually see how easily these models, like the models underlying ChatGPT, will veer into generating very offensive examples, sometimes covertly offensive, but still deeply harmful examples. It seems like they've been trained on white supremacy forums. Um, so I think that one thing I worry about a lot is how these technologies, while there is the positive standpoint of the possibility of uh, scaling interventions by using AI models, there's also the possibility of them being misused to spread more harmful content and to manipulate people and to potentially incite hate and violence. And that's something I think that we need to be aware of and really careful about in terms of uh, thinking about how the content that we're being exposed to online and how can we think critically about that content. And then on the part of the developers, making sure that they're not creating tools that could ultimately exacerbate the harmful behaviors we're seeing online. What gives me hope, I touched on this a little bit earlier in my response to the audience question, but I have seen that there's a lot more interest in funding going to AI safety. I've seen specific calls that were talking about wanting human generated data and focusing on more user-centric approaches and trying to bring human perspectives um, into the loop in validating technologies instead of just trying to automate the whole process. So that gives me hope that they're at the higher level in terms of these large, corporate stakeholders. There is some awareness of what's going on, and there's some interest in trying to play a part in mitigating these problems. And I also have optimism stemming from our own work where we've uh, been trying to see how do we actually come up with interventions that are effective in breaking down barriers that are formed online. So the barriers that we see emerging sometimes from the very design of social media platforms where people don't necessarily interact with other communities beyond their own and with people who are uh, might have different values from them or have grown up in different backgrounds, look different from them. They end up in these sort of bubbles of sameness because of the way that social media is set up. And I do have some hope that through the interventions we are developing and others are developing, that there's some possibility of breaking through these barriers and providing people with the tools to do more critical thinking and to engage with perspectives beyond their own. So I think those are the primary things I would highlight.
Thank you. And I think and then I'd love to hear from Christine, but I think your work gives me hope, all of your work right here that you've discussed today. Christine, how about you? What keeps you up at night and what gives you hope?
Sure. I guess what keeps me up at night, well, a lot of things, but a few things. Sada, you've mentioned several times, unintentional or inadvertent ways that we might be harming those who are most vulnerable in our efforts, whether it be through moderation or interventions. Always being mindful of that. And that we're really thinking about, especially those who have the least voice right now. I guess connected to that, it's, we were talking about technology and social media, but we've also talked a lot about context. Hate isn't new, but I started as an early childhood teacher, and one thing that was so important was establishing a rapport, a community where people felt safe. They felt included. Their voice mattered. And right now, that is not necessarily the case in our world. And it's, I think, very hard to talk about interventions or how we work on, say, social media hate prevention without recognizing that the world itself and adults also could really benefit from learning more about reflection, empathy, listening to the other. What gives me hope, and I should have mentioned this so much earlier, is we can't do this alone. And for the work that I'm involved in, we really need the young people to be part of the effort. So we do have teen advisors. We've been doing some focus groups and discussions, interviews, and we're really hoping to bring them on board in a more active way to design some future activities, because they're the experts. They're the ones that can explain what makes something hateful and why, or in what circumstance. And so there's some great activities out there in a way that is just incredibly creative that young people are doing.
Thank you so much, Christine. And I'll just read Bethan's and then I'll answer the question to myself. So Bethan writes, what keeps me up at night is how easy it is for someone to slip into being hateful, even extremely violently hateful. As a historian, I know that hate doesn't end insofar as new generations are born and will struggle with hate yet again. That said, I find hope in the fact that so many people do stand up to hate, and I am lucky to call so many of them colleagues. That's a beautiful statement, Bethan. Thank you. And I think for me, what keeps me up at night, because I do a lot of research on the intersection of misogyny, gender-based violence, and hate, and performance practices, but is just the changing landscape and the kind of escalating landscape of misogyny, especially in the context of incels and other extremist groups that are operationalizing misogyny, like we've talked about. But what gives me hope, a couple of things. More and more people are recognizing that it's a problem. There's shows like Adolescent. If you in the audience haven't seen it, please go out and see it, Adolescents. Recognizing this epidemic in younger and younger boys. Also just the increasing recognition of, like I was talking about, the loneliness epidemic, which is, serves as a kind of a catalyst, as I mentioned. There was recently there's about to be or going to be an article that's coming out. I can't remember if it's Vanity Fair or Cosmopolitan, where a woman actually talks about her experiences dating right-wing extremists. She went undercover and actually is talking about how the conversations that a lot of these men are having, while they are misogynistic, a lot of them are also just talking about how basically like lonely they are and how much they feel like they're not worthy. I just think that more and more people are publishing pieces on this or talking about this or making films about this. And I think that's so critical. And Christine, you talked about the power of storytelling. And I think that the more and more films and novels and that kind of content is out there, it can really change hearts and minds. And another thing the last thing that gives me hope is the fact that more and more of my students in my class on gender-based violence are young boys or young men, young college-aged men, who I would not have assumed would ever be interested in a class. I've been teaching a course on gender-based violence since 2019. I started teaching a course on the Me Too movement, and then since then have taught on gender-based violence. And I have each year, I see more and more and more cisgender young men in my classes who are really passionate about fighting the epidemic of violence against women. And so I think, thank you all for just being such excellent panelists and your contributions not only to this conversation, but to making the world ultimately a more compassionate place where we all can understand and fight against hate better.
I want to thank all of you. And what I am hopeful about is all of your research and what you are doing. But also, I'm hopeful that we can use this research to build what somebody said earlier, a less hateful and more compassionate world. So we thank you all for all of this. To our wonderful moderator, Dr. Amalia Mora, to Sadia Gabriel, fascinating research, Dr. Bethan Johnson. It's so interesting. I can't wait to read what you have written in the chat. And to Dr. Christine Ong, thank you so much for such great insights. It was really very interesting. Thank you again. And thank you as well to the Women in Philanthropy members and other UCLA supporters for participating this evening. I'd also like to extend our tremendous appreciation to Kelly Angaro, Juan Mejia, and Sofia Escobar from the development events team for helping with all of the Zoom meeting logistics. And as always, thank you to Melissa Efron Hayek, Executive Director of Women in Philanthropy, and Betty Montagna, Associate Director of Women in Philanthropy. We will be hosting a fall event webinar, so please be on the lookout over the summer for that invitation. And again, thank you to our panelists and moderator. It was such a wonderful evening. Thank you.